Hey everyone, before we get into this video, I'd like to make a clarification on the video that you're about to watch. So in it, I refer to a string as a value type variable. Strings behave like value type variables, but they are behind the scenes a reference type. But for the sake of this next tutorial, I think it's useful to see something more tangible like a string that although it behaves like a value type variable, is technically behind the scenes reference type. For the purposes of our next video, I think that it serves just as well as an integer or a Boolean. So just keep that in mind while you're watching it. Thanks. Hey everyone, and welcome to our functions and objects tutorial in C#. As you can see, I have Visual Studio pulled up here, and I have our boilerplate code ready to go. I also have our person class from a previous tutorial. So passing in a complex object, such as the one created from the person class, is written in the same way as you would pass in a normal value type object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a value type object and a complex object of class person or of type person, and I'm going to pass them both into two separate functions and compare and contrast what's happening in these functions and how the parameters are treated. So let's get rid of this console write line and let's create our old friend string first name. We've been using this variable or something like this variable since the very beginning, so this should be very familiar to you guys. Next, let's create a person object, person1. Get this new person. Oops. And so obviously we're just creating an object that is using the blueprint down here. Okay, so now let's create our static functions. So we're going to create two functions that are both static because we're going to be using them in our static main method here. And I just want these functions to say like hello and then somebody's name. So we're going to call them print greeting. We're going to call this function print greeting, and we'll create the scope there. For our parameter in print greeting, we are going to pass in a string and we'll call it name. And inside of the function, we'll do a write line and it will say hello name. Okay, awesome. And so I'll actually just, in our main function, I'll call it here. We'll do a print greeting, and I'll pass in first name as the parameter and end it with a semicolon. Okay, cool. Now, for person1, before we create a function and pass it in, let's set first name here to equal Daniel. And now let's create the function that we're going to pass in our person object to. I'm just going to copy and paste this because we can use the exact same thing, almost. So, we're going to pass in, instead of passing in a string like up here, we're going to pass in a person object. And this person parameter will be called person. Oops. Awesome. So now, down here, we can put hello person, but we can't just say hello person because when we print out person, it will print out the class name person. We need to access one of our member variables in here. And so we do that obviously by just saying dot first name. So what this will do is it'll take the first name variable of our person, which up here we have assigned to Daniel, and it will print it out. And this works in almost the same way as our print greeting does over here, where we just take our string and print it out. So below our other print greeting, we're going to do it again, call it again, but this time I'll pass in person1. So you can see how a complex object like person, or complex type like person, is used in a function, or is passed into a function in the same way that a value type is passed into a function. So it's a very similar process for both. So now let's run this code, and let's see what happens. Awesome. So we have hello Pete and hello Daniel. Cool. I'm going to close this terminal. And so before I close the terminal though, what's happening here is that we take our first name variable and we pass it into our print greeting function. And our first name variable gets copied over into this parameter called string name. Inside of this scope, string name is a totally separate variable from first name. So inside of this function, we can actually reassign the name variable to be Taylor, and we can print this out and it'll say, hello Taylor. After we call this function, we can go through and print out console write line, and we can say string value after function, and we'll print out first name. Cool. So let's see, actually, you know what, before we do that, let's also print it out before. And then, so we'll print out the value of first name before we pass it into the function. We'll print it as the greeting in the function, and then we'll print it out after the function. All right, let's close the terminal, and let's do this. Cool. So you can see string value before the function is Pete, right? So right here, the string value before the function is our first name Pete. Then we pass that variable into our function print greeting. That value gets copied over into our function, and inside of our function, we replace the value of name with Taylor, and then we print that out here. And so we see Taylor printed out here. After that, we leave the scope of this function. So our variable, our name variable, no longer exists outside of this function, and we print out first name again. And since first name was copied when it was passed into print greeting, it gets copied over. That copy does not carry over outside of the scope of this function. So when we print after the function, we see that Pete is still there. So you see what's happening there? The value, the variable gets copied over. So there's two copies, one outside the function and one inside the function. The one inside the function gets changed to Taylor. The one outside of the function stays Pete. Now this will be a little bit different when we pass in our complex object. So remember, our complex object of person, this variable contains a reference, right? This variable contains a value. So remember in our previous tutorials, when you create multiple variables that reference one object, both of those variables can change the object. And this is true inside of a function as well. So let's do a console.writeLine, and let's write person value before function. And I'm going to do person1 dot first name. And then I will copy this and I'll paste it down here. I'll say after a function. And inside of our print greeting function for person, I'm going to do person dot first name equals Mildred. Okay, so let's run this. Let's see what happens. Okay, so our string prints out as it did before, and we know how that works. Now our person value, before it goes in, it's Daniel. I'll go over here and you see that it's Daniel. When we go into our function, it says hello, Mildred. So we go into our function, we see that our person variable is assigned to Mildred, and it prints hello, Mildred. And now, after our function, it stays Mildred. So why is that? It's because our string, unlike our string value, our person value has a reference to this object. So it's, there's only one object, and the variable person1 references that object. When we go down to our print greeting function, we copy in that reference. So we don't copy the object, we copy in the reference. And so that reference still points to our one object. So when we change it to Mildred inside of the function, that change stays even after the function is over. That change stays because there was only one object. In our print greeting with our string name, we copied the object over. In this function, we copied the reference to the object. So there was only ever one object, one person object. So in the string situation, we had one variable inside the function and one variable outside the function. In the print greeting for person, there was only one object and two pointers to that object, two references to that object. So that's something you need to be aware of when you're passing in complex objects or reference value objects into functions. So I know this can be a little bit confusing, but just go back and kind of work with this material a little bit on your own, passing in value types, passing in reference types, and kind of play with it and get a better feel for how this works. And of course, you can watch this video as many times as you want to, as slow as you want to make sure that you fully grasp this concept. So thanks, guys. This has been a little bit more in-depth discussion of functions and objects in C#.